Welcome to our video interview with Amy Luers. Amy Luers is the Executive Director of Future Earth and the Director of the Center for Sustainability in the Digital Age. She has over 25 years of experience working at the intersection of science, technology, and policy on the matter of climate change. She's a former assistant director in the Obama White House, senior manager at Google, and she's a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, has served on committees of the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the National Academies of Sciences. Dr. Luers, this video and broadcast is going out to people who are psychoanalysts and people in mental health work. So for that audience, I would like to ask you, how do you see the intersect of climate change and this pandemic that we are in the midst of? What are there ways that something good around climate change could emerge in the wake of this, or are there some difficulties? And how do you see and work with this current moment we're in?
Thank you for these important questions. I think one of the most important things for us all to get or experience or realize from this crisis that we're in is how tightly coupled human health and planetary health are. Science has known this for a long time, but I think we're seeing this today. So the COVID crisis has emerged from the coronavirus, which is a zoonotic disease. It's a disease that means it's one that jumps from animals to humans. And increasingly, the infectious diseases that are spreading today are zoonotic. In fact, between 70 to 75% of the new emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic diseases. And these are emerging because of how what we are doing to the planet. The destruction of habitat, increasingly encroaching upon wildlife habitat and destroying their habitat is putting us in closer contact to ecosystems that were in natural balance and could manage those diseases that aren't diseases for them, but the virus has come and then spread very quickly into society. So I think one issue is the connection between planetary health and human health are so important. But a related issue is that how interdependent we all are. And we can't solve the crises of today, whether they be environmental, economic, or social, without working together. And so these issues when we think about these issues of addressing global sustainability crisis, the values of individualism versus collectivism versus being part of a team of being individual. And as we see those around the world, it's quite pronounced. And a third related issue to both of these is just a recognition that the coronavirus and the COVID-19 crisis is not a black swan. This is something that it's one example of a broader global systemic crisis that the scientific community has been predicting, not just specifically about pandemics, but overall. And I think from a sort of mental health perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges that also has been predicted in the sustainability world and the climate world is that the cascading effect. And I think we're moving into that now. We're coming into the hurricane crisis here of hurricane season in the US, wildfire season, flooding season. As these come on top of each other, they put stresses on our economy, but they also put stresses on the social and mental health of the communities. The one thing I would say in a positive note in the context of this is that, there's lots of opportunities that people are talking about in the climate space right now about steering the direction of the recovery investments to make them green and clean. But there's another opportunity, and that's a mindset shift. And I think that's the one that's really, really important, and not clear how to take it as an opportunity and not just as a challenge. I think all of us are rethinking our place in this planet and how we live our lives. And how do we do that in a way that doesn't drain us, but can empower us to be better global citizens?
Wow, that's a lot to absorb and think about, but it's a wonderful challenge also. I wanted to ask you a question about a new project you have as part of Future Earth, which is called Sustainability in the Digital Age. So why is this one of the developmental directions you are going, and what do you want to see out of this project, and how might it actually fit into any of the challenges that you've been outlining for us around collective work, sustainability, not becoming overwhelmed with a cascading effect?
Yeah, so we recently over the last year we've been developing this initiative, Sustainability in the Digital Age, and the premise of this is that humanity today is interconnected through and dependent on both the natural and digital world. And we're seeing that today. Of course, in this crisis, become very evident. In some ways, the digital world is saving the whole economy from crashing. It's allowing some of us to maintain our jobs. But on the other hand, 50% of the world isn't online. And many people can't do their jobs online. And also the digital world is separating us. And there's, of course, a huge power by certain companies to influence the direction of our thinking, what we read, what we buy, who we connect to, who we vote with. And so this power, this unbalance in power, and that hasn't been governed. The digital world really emerged without governance. And it has a power that is much more influential than I think really expected. And so there's a lot of work in the digital space that's looking to protect privacy, protect the facts and truth by just addressing that in isolation. But this initiative is looking at, is to say, this is an incredible power that isn't going to go away. And so one way to do it is to say, how can we squash those powers? And another is to say, how do we leverage those powers to get the world we choose, not the world that's chosen for us? And that is the focus of this initiative, to say, how can we govern the digital world so that it can help to build a climate safe and equitable world, rather than the one that it's steering us towards today.
That is an extraordinarily ambitious project. How, just give us briefly a little taste of what are the projects that are coming from this vision?
So one of the areas, this all started before the COVID crisis. And so you can imagine that we have rethought it a bit because I think it's become actually more relevant. But one of the areas in particular is simply the climate governance space. So the way that climate has been governed today, for many, many years, decades, it was the international climate governance was focused on getting one UN governance agreement with commitments. As you probably know, we failed for a long time until 2015. And it was focused on one agreement, and that almost became a goal in itself, rather than creating the vision we want. And that's because, in part, the international governance structures that were set up, the UN system, was really set up to manage, to prevent wars between nations, to manage material goods between nations. But the world that we are in today, the digital world, the world that was set up with the governing bodies, the foundation of that is really an analog world. But what would you think about how would you approach the climate governance? How would you solve this problem in today's world? We need a new toolbox, and a new toolbox, not just technologies, but strategies. And there's been a lot of investments in the technologies, but not on the social and institutional. And how do we work together with those? And that's the focus of this. How do we, for example, this is one example of the projects. We have projects in different sectors, but one that's moving forward a little bit more rapidly. And we have a lot of investments in isolated technologies. And so, for example, right now, there's a lot of tools and a lot of data around. You can almost, in many places, you can see almost every tree. You can increasingly see the emissions from different sectors of climate heat trapping gases. And so if everybody can see them, how can you create checks and balances and govern that system in a way that doesn't necessarily go through a central body, but is supported by the complex regimes and networks of communities, civil societies, businesses that are working together? And how can you empower that doesn't replace the centralized system, but rather complements it? It empowers us in some ways. There's been some discussion about there was this vision that the digital world would democratize information. And of course, it hasn't done that completely because of the power structures and now we are faced with questions like, who defines reality? Who defines the world? Who defines facts, and who defines other truths? Those are questions that we see have to be part of the climate change challenge now. They can't be seen as independent, but as parallel. And so we're looking at the climate governance through those lenses, rather than the traditional lens of just simply establishing an agreement in the UN.
Wow. I would love to hear you talk for hours on this. This is really exciting and demanding of a lot of thought from those of us who are going to be listening to you and thinking about what you've laid out for us. So thank you very much for giving us this time and all of this stimulating material and ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.